The silence was absolute. Kirk Douglas, at 42 years old, one of Hollywood's most athletic and intimidating leading men, stood frozen beside the makeshift shooting range that had been set up behind Paramount Studios on November 23, 1958. Around him, a dozen other major stars who had gathered for what they expected to be casual entertainment after a rap party stood equally motionless, their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something that challenges fundamental assumptions about human limitations and the relationship between physical disability and capability. Sammy Davis Jr., at 33 years old and 4 years after losing his left eye in a devastating car accident, calmly holstered his weapon and looked at the assembled group of Hollywood's biggest names with the patient dignity of someone who had just provided a masterclass in why assumptions about disability were not just wrong, but dangerous. The target, a playing card pinned to a tree 25 yards away, had a bullet hole precisely through its center, achieved in what couldn't have been more than 0.19 seconds by a man who theoretically shouldn't have been able to judge distance accurately enough to hit the broadside of a barn, let alone demonstrate pinpoint accuracy that exceeded anything the assembled stars had ever witnessed from able-bodied marksmen. This is the untold story of the night when Hollywood's most physically gifted performers learned that true strength isn't measured by what you have, but by what you do with whatever remains after life has taken everything you thought you needed. The evening had begun as a celebration. The rap party for the Vikings had been going strong for hours, with Kirk Douglas hosting an informal gathering of Hollywood's leading men at his Beverly Hills home. The guest list represented the pinnacle of 1950s masculine stardom: Burt Lancaster, Tony Curtis, Rock Hudson, and a dozen other actors who had built their careers on projecting physical confidence and athletic superiority. These were men who prided themselves on being genuinely tough, rather than just playing tough on screen. They hunted, they sailed, they flew planes, and they approached physical challenges with the kind of competitive enthusiasm that had made them stars in an industry that valued authentic masculinity, which is why the conversation had inevitably turned to firearms and marksmanship, an area where several of the assembled actors had developed genuine expertise and took pride in their abilities. "Sammy's been pretty quiet tonight," Kirk Douglas had observed, looking across the patio to where Sammy Davis Jr. was sitting slightly apart from the main group, nursing a drink and watching the conversation with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was being discussed rather than included. "Well," Tony Curtis had replied with the casual cruelty that sometimes characterized Hollywood's social dynamics, "It's probably hard to participate in shooting conversations when you can't judge distance anymore." The comment was delivered with a smile, as if it were merely playful banter, but everyone present understood the underlying message: that Sammy's 1954 car accident, which had cost him his left eye, had automatically disqualified him from activities requiring depth perception and spatial judgment. "That's a hell of a thing to lose," Rock Hudson added, his tone suggesting sympathy mixed with the kind of relief that came from knowing such a catastrophe hadn't happened to him, especially for someone who was getting pretty good with guns before the accident. The conversation was rapidly becoming a discussion about Sammy rather than with him, and the tone was shifting from casual interest to something approaching pity, mixed with the dismissive attitude that able-bodied people sometimes showed toward those they perceived as damaged. "I heard he used to be decent with quick-draw before he lost the eye," Lancaster commented, "but depth perception is everything in marksmanship. Without it, you're basically shooting blind." Douglas nodded sagely. "It's like losing your balance as a dancer, or your voice as a singer. Some things you just can't compensate for, no matter how hard you try." The analysis was delivered with the authority of men who had never faced such challenges and therefore felt qualified to pronounce judgment on what was and wasn't possible for those who had. Sammy continued to listen in silence, but those who knew him well could see the familiar stillness that indicated he was processing not just the words but the assumptions behind them. Throughout his career, he had faced countless situations where people told him what he couldn't do based on their understanding of his limitations, and he had developed a systematic approach to addressing such assumptions when they became too explicit to ignore. "You know," Curtis continued, warming to the theme, It's probably for the best that he's focusing on singing and dancing now. Those are areas where the eye injury doesn't matter as much. The comment represented a complete dismissal of any possibility that Sammy could maintain competence in areas requiring visual precision, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who assumed that physical disability automatically meant comprehensive limitation. Finally, Sammy set down his drink and stood up. "Interesting conversation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that suggested careful consideration rather than emotional reaction. "Seems like you fellows have strong opinions about what's possible and what isn't." Douglas looked slightly uncomfortable, recognizing that the conversation had perhaps gone further than social politeness normally allowed. "We didn't mean anything personal, Sammy. Just discussing the practical realities of marksmanship." "Practical realities are exactly what I'd like to discuss," Sammy replied. "Because it seems like there might be some misunderstanding about what those realities actually are." The challenge was polite, but unmistakable. Sammy was suggesting that their assumptions about his capabilities might be based on theory rather than evidence. "What did you have in mind?" Lancaster asked, his competitive instincts engaging despite his awareness that the situation was potentially awkward. Sammy gestured toward the back of Douglas's property, where a makeshift shooting range had been set up earlier in the evening for some casual target practice. "Why don't we test whether your theories about depth perception and marksmanship hold up under actual conditions?" The proposal created an immediate dilemma for the assembled actors. They had just spent 20 minutes explaining why Sammy couldn't possibly compete in marksmanship activities, and declining his challenge would suggest that they weren't confident in their analysis. But accepting it risked the possibility of being proven wrong in front of their peers. Douglas, as the host, felt obligated to respond. "Sammy, we're not trying to embarrass you. Everyone knows you've had to adjust to significant changes since the accident." "I appreciate your concern," Sammy replied. "But I'm not asking for sympathy or special consideration. I'm asking for the same kind of fair test that you'd give any other marksman who claimed to have useful skills." The request was reasonable and impossible to refuse without appearing both cowardly and condescending. "What kind of test?" Hudson asked cautiously. Sammy walked over to the shooting area and examined the available targets. Standard paper targets, tin cans, bottles, nothing that would provide a particularly challenging test of precision shooting. "Let's make it interesting," Sammy said, pulling a playing card from his pocket, the ace of spades. He walked toward a large oak tree at the far end of the property and pinned the card to the trunk with a small nail. 25 yards, he announced, pacing off the distance. "Standard quick draw. First to hit the card wins." The challenge was more difficult than anything the assembled actors had attempted that evening. 25 yards was a respectable distance for precision shooting, and hitting a playing card required accuracy that exceeded casual recreational marksmanship. "That's a tough target," Curtis observed, "even with good depth perception." "Even with good depth perception," Sammy agreed. "So if I can hit it, that should settle the question about what's possible and what isn't." The assembled actors exchanged glances, recognizing that they had been maneuvered into a position where they had to either accept the challenge or acknowledge that their earlier analysis had been presumptuous and possibly wrong. "Fair enough," Douglas said finally, "but let's make it a group challenge. Anyone who thinks they can hit that card from 25 yards can try." Several of the actors stepped forward to accept the challenge, including Lancaster, Curtis, and Hudson. Each was confident in his shooting ability and saw the contest as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of masculine competence that defined their on-screen personas. They took turns shooting at the card, and while several came close, none achieved a direct hit. The playing card remained intact, a small but visible target that proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. "Tough shot," Lancaster admitted after his attempt. "That card's smaller than it looks from here." Finally, it was Sammy's turn. He took his position at the shooting line, and the assembled actors prepared to witness what they expected would be a well-intentioned but unsuccessful attempt by someone whose visual limitations made precise marksmanship essentially impossible. What they witnessed instead redefined their understanding of human adaptability and the relationship between disability and capability. Sammy's draw was not just fast, it was impossibly fast, executing in what couldn't have been more than 0.19 seconds. But more importantly, it was accurate. The bullet struck the playing card dead center, punching a clean hole through the ace of spades. The assembled actors stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Not only had Sammy matched their best efforts, he had exceeded them while operating with what they had assumed was a crippling disadvantage. How was all Douglas could manage. Sammy's explanation revealed not just technical adaptation, but a philosophical approach to overcoming limitations that none of the assembled actors had previously considered. "You're right about depth perception being important for marksmanship," Sammy said, "but you're wrong about it being essential. When I lost my left eye, I had to learn different ways to judge distance and alignment." He demonstrated his modified shooting stance, showing how he had developed techniques for using shadows, angular relationships, and other visual cues to compensate for the loss of stereoscopic vision. "Instead of relying on depth perception, I learned to use what vision I had left more effectively. I developed better focus, better concentration, and better understanding of ballistics and trajectory." The explanation continued for several minutes, with Sammy revealing the scientific approach he had taken to adapting his marksmanship skills to his changed physical condition. Rather than accepting limitations, he had studied the problem and engineered solutions that not only restored his previous capability but enhanced it. "The accident didn't end my shooting career," Sammy said. "It forced me to become a better marksman than I had ever been before." Curtis shook his head in amazement. "You're saying that losing your eye actually made you a better shooter?" "I'm saying that facing limitations forced me to develop capabilities that I wouldn't have discovered if everything had been easy," Sammy replied. "When you can't rely on natural advantages, you have to get really good at understanding the fundamentals." Lancaster studied the target with new respect. "That's not just good shooting, that's exceptional shooting. Better than anything we managed tonight. Better than anything most able-bodied marksmen achieve," Hudson added. "You've proven that our assumptions about disability and capability were completely wrong." The acknowledgments represented a complete reversal of the evening's earlier conversation. The men who had spent the first part of the evening explaining why Sammy's limitations made him unsuitable for marksmanship activities were now recognizing that he had achieved levels of excellence that exceeded their own capabilities. But Sammy wasn't finished with his lesson. "There's something else you should understand," he said, addressing the group directly. "What you saw tonight wasn't me overcoming a disability. It was me refusing to accept other people's definitions of what I could and couldn't accomplish." The distinction was important and profound. Sammy was explaining that the real limitation hadn't been his physical condition. It had been the assumptions that others made about what that condition meant. "The accident changed how I see, but it didn't change how I think or how hard I'm willing to work to achieve what I want to accomplish," Sammy continued. "The biggest obstacles I've faced haven't been physical. They've been people telling me what's possible and what isn't, based on what they think they know about disability." Douglas looked genuinely chastened. "We owe you an apology. We made assumptions about your capabilities based on our own fears about what we'd be able to do in your situation." "No apology necessary," Sammy replied, "but maybe next time you'll ask someone what they can do instead of telling them what they can't." The conversation continued for another hour, with the assembled actors asking detailed questions about adaptation techniques, training methodologies, and the mental preparation required to achieve excellence under challenging conditions. It became clear that Sammy's approach to overcoming limitations involved the same dedication to excellence that had made him successful in entertainment, applied to areas where most people would have accepted defeat. "You've taught us something important tonight," Lancaster said as the evening concluded. "Not just about marksmanship, but about assumptions and limitations, and what's possible when someone refuses to accept other people's definitions of their capabilities. The encounter that night was never reported in entertainment magazines or industry publications, but the story spread through Hollywood's insider network, becoming one of those legendary tales that redefined how major stars thought about disability, limitation, and the relationship between physical challenges and human potential. The actors who were present that night returned to their careers with new appreciation for the different forms that strength and capability could take. Several made efforts to learn more about disability rights and the importance of not making assumptions about what people could accomplish based on their physical condition. Sammy, for his part, had once again demonstrated that his approach to challenges, whether they involved racial prejudice, industry skepticism, or physical disability, was consistent. Refuse to accept limitations imposed by others, work harder than anyone expects, and prove capabilities through demonstration rather than argument. Years later, when Kirk Douglas was asked about the most impressive display of courage and skill he had ever witnessed, he would always give the same answer: Sammy Davis Jr., one eye, 25 yards, dead center. And he taught me that strength isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with whatever you've got left. The lesson of that night went beyond marksmanship or entertainment industry politics. It was a reminder that human potential often exceeded the boundaries that seemed obvious, that disability didn't automatically mean limitation, and that the most dangerous assumptions were those that told people what they couldn't accomplish based on their physical condition. The playing card with its bullet hole became a symbol of something larger than marksmanship excellence. It became proof that when talent meets determination and refuses to accept defeat, the results can exceed what anyone thought was possible. And in Hollywood, where physical perfection was often considered essential for success, that lesson was worth more than any role, any contract, or any recognition. Because when you can silence a room full of athletic superstars with a single shot, you've proven that true strength isn't measured by what you look like. It's measured by what you can accomplish when everyone else says it's impossible.